After the Apocalypse, Start a Family by Magical Persona. The fandom is Left for Dead 2. Chapter 1. Nick stood with a 3-year-old on his hip, washing the dishes. It had been a year since the apocalypse ended, and somehow the world was put back together enough for it to function as it did before. Of course, there were differences. The backyard was no bigger than a sandbox, and everyone had to stay inside the gates that surrounded the small city. It was the only place they were supposedly safe from the lingering infected. Ellis was the one who worked to support their little family. Nick occasionally made a few bucks here and there, but by this point most knew not to gamble with him. He'd thought about getting a job, but of all the things to have survived the apocalypse, his criminal record was still one of them. He wouldn't have done well in a stable job anyway, and someone had to look after Rosemary. They had taken her in at the CETA survivor camp. Leave it to Ellis to bring a child back to the tent, claiming it was theirs now. Nick had been opposed to it at first. Clearly, Ellis had no idea what it was like to care for a child and how difficult it would be to build a life with a child in tow. It was also clear that Ellis didn't care. Rosemary reached up to play with Nick's slick-backed hair. He grabbed her wrists and looked at her with the harshest glare he could muster. It was not that harsh. "Did no one ever teach you not to touch a man's hair?" he asked, his voice filled with a playful anger. The 3-year-old smiled brightly, her brown eyes sparkling as she shook her head. "No?" Nick asked incredulously, still with that playful tone. "Well, my work is never done," he said as he tickled her. Rosemary erupted into a fit of loud giggles, and Nick allowed himself to smile. He placed her on the floor, patted her head of curly brown hair, and was about to speak when the front door opened and then closed. "I'm home." Ellis's voice rang throughout the house. "Pa!" Rosemary shouted happily as she ran to Ellis. "Ellis, don't you drag oil through this house," Nick snapped over Rosemary. "Don't worry, Nick," Ellis laughed and groaned as he picked Rosemary up. He walked over to stand in the doorway of the kitchen that led to the dining room as Nick finished the last of the dishes. "I think she likes me better." "You're never home. You aren't the one who has to tell her no," Nick pointed out, pretending it made him angry. Ellis smiled, placing a kiss on Nick's cheek. "You smell like a garage," Nick muttered. Not that it was Ellis's fault. That was where he worked, fixing and maintaining the CETA vehicles. It was good money considering Nick didn't really have the ability to work. "Don't forget, Ro and Coach are coming over for dinner," Ellis said. "Don't forget?" Nick asked. "When were you going to tell me the first time?" Ellis gave Nick an embarrassed smile. "I just did." "Ellis, this house isn't ready for guests." Man, Ellis could be so dense sometimes. "Look at it. The clothes need to be folded, the rooms need to be cleaned, and all of Rosemary's toys need picked up." "Nick, we lived in worse during the zombie apocalypse," Ellis pointed out gently, a small smile ghosting at the corners of his mouth. "They ain't gonna mind." "They might not, but I do." Nick's voice was rising. "Do you want them to think we live in a barn?" "This one time my buddy Keith lived in a barn for a year," Ellis said before he could stop himself. "It wasn't actually that bad. He had it all dressed up and nice and purty." Nick sighed. "Ellis, you and Rosemary clean the living room. I'll fold the laundry and get dinner started. Deal?" Ellis smiled brightly, tossing Rosemary into the air and catching her, causing the little girl to start giggling again. "Let's go to the living room before Daddy gets cranky," Ellis said jokingly. "I'm not cranky, Ellis," Nick replied as his husband walked away. "You just need to get better at telling me who's coming over and when."
Thank you so much for listening to Chapter 1. The next chapter is going to be out on next Thursday, so stay tuned for Chapter 2 and a bunch more fun and exciting things. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all again.